Let's Talk About is a series that we decided our community needs. We actually came up with this concept about 2 years ago, and it took us a while to figure out what we were doing, and we're still figuring out what we're doing, and we don't have answers. It's not always, what we do is not meant to be a debate. It's meant to be an illumination. It's meant to be the opportunity for people who are curious about something or puzzled about something to ask questions and to learn from people who may have some answers for us. So Dr. Gayle Pitman is here. And I was first introduced to her through her book, This Day in June, which is a wildly popular book here at Sacramento Public Library, and it's about the first gay pride parade, and it's a picture book. Dr. Gayle Pitman is a professor of psychology and women and gender studies at Sacramento City College. She serves on the boards of the Gender Health Center and Girls Rock Sacramento, an organization that empowers those who identify as girls and women, and it's done through music education. So we have another gem who's going to be here today joining us, and that's Rachael Hudson, who is the Community Outreach Director from the Gender Health Center. And Rachael sat on the original planning board for the Gender Health Center and was voted in as its first employee when it opened in 2010. And she also has co-founded not one, but 2 support groups for trans families. So we're very honored that both Rachael and Dr. Pitman have agreed to give up their beautiful Sunday afternoon to be with us. And so we're gonna get them out here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm still trying to figure out, like, do I need to stand up straighter or do I need to fix the mic? So I might do a little bit of maneuvering here. You might as well, I'm guessing. So Rivka had just asked each of you not to speak without using a mic, and so I feel like I'm going to be the one that is transgressive, not transgender, I'm not transgender, transgressive, and break the rules because, so I teach at Sacramento City College, and one of the things that I like to do with my students, especially when I'm introducing a topic, and especially if my class is in the morning and they're not like quite awake or engaged or there, is I don't start off by just talking at them, I start to engage them right away. We start to do an activity, and so I was thinking that that might be an interesting way for us to start off this discussion. I also don't mind making my students a little bit uncomfortable, and they understand that going in, that discomfort is a place of learning, and so, you know, let's embrace it rather than trying to run away from it. So I'm just giving you full disclosure here. So here's what I'd like to do to start this off, and I think this will help both of us kind of engage in some discussions. So if you are, okay, I'm gonna use a lot of different terms. If you are heterosexual, if you are cisgender, does everybody know what cisgender means? Cisgender means that the gender that you were assigned at birth matches your gender identity, right? So probably the vast majority of us are cisgender. There's certainly lots of people who are not, and we're going to talk about that. So if you're heterosexual, cisgender, essentially meaning not transgender, and male, please raise your hand. Okay, and keep your hands up, because this is where it's going to get uncomfortable. How do you know this?
I'm guessing.
You're guessing, okay. And is this an educated guess, or is this like a shot in the dark guess?
Educated.
Educated. Educated based on what?
How I was raised.
So how you were raised, okay. So I'll just extrapolate a little bit. It sounds like you're saying that your parents or your family raised you to conform to gender norms that are typical for a boy. Is that fair? Okay. How do you know that you're male? Mm-hmm. Sir in the blue shirt. Yes. I know there's a lot of, I was going to say the glasses and the blue shirt, and I'm realizing there's a lot of glasses and blue shirts, so that doesn't really help. Okay. Okay. So, so he said that pretty much the same, you know, being raised kind of to conform to gender to that are more typical for a boy. Just to play a little devil's advocate, So I'm female. I've never questioned my gender identity. I am cisgender. I have always known that I was female ever since I understood the meaning of the word. I have no brothers, so my father had no sons, and I think he was quite disappointed by that. So I don't know. He took me to baseball games. He took me fishing. He played catch with me in the backyard. Does that mean that I'm a boy? No? Okay. So that's helpful, but not sufficient, right? They're being raised according to boy gender norms. Okay. I see all the hands have gone down. Now everyone's like, oh, I don't want you calling me now. Yes. How do you know that you're a male?
Growing up, biology.
Biology. Like what kind of biology? Okay.
That way, being told that I'm a boy.
Okay, so you're saying two things, right? Having a penis, having the, genitalia that's typically associated with being a boy, being told you're a boy, right? For many of us, that's kind of how it starts off, right? Like we're told who we are, we're given a name, we're given a label, and then we're raised a certain way and so forth. As for the biological aspect, and I'll ask you, but also the other males who raised their hands, if you didn't have a penis, would that mean that you're not male anymore? Is that too threatening of a question to ask? So like, whoa, let's not go there. No. The thing that I often joke with when I ask this question of my students, I often ask them, oh, when you wake up in the morning, do you need to look down and make sure it's still there to confirm that you're actually still a boy? Most of the time they say no and they laugh. Every once in a while I get a student that's like, well, sometimes, Yes, over there. How do you know that you're male? Experience, like what? What kind of experience? Okay. Okay. So you're saying that your sexual experiences, your intimate experiences have helped to confirm your male gender identity. Now, do you have to have sexual experiences with a certain type of person in order to be a male? Clearly not, right? I mean, there's a wide range of sexual orientations and attractions that people can have. This is what I usually kind of wrap up that discussion with my students. And I frame it as, I generally live in the world of the scientific and intellectual. But I ask my students, how do you know, my male, cisgender, heterosexual students, how many of you know that you're male because you just know, right? Like regardless of biology, regardless of upbringing, regardless of attractions to other, you just know, right? How many of you have that experience? Like you just know your gender identity. You don't need people to tell you, or you don't need to look down at your body and check it out. Yeah, it's not very scientific, right? It's more, I don't know if you have a word for it. It's more instinctual.
Not scientific.
Okay. It's not scientific. Or maybe it is, and we just haven't gotten that far, right? Like we haven't come up with words or come up with language or come up with research to really get at the essence of whatever that inner something happens to be. There's a handout. If you get a chance to go over there, maybe if somebody even wanted to pass it out, there's a couple of handouts that I have over there on the table. And I apologize, one of them is really big. I didn't mean for it to be really big. I went to Kinko's and copied it, and I saw that it did it on the really big paper, and I made 100 of them, and I was like, and I didn't know how to stop the thing, so it's really big. You can put it on your wall, and you can draw on it, and and it's large print, so if you have eyesight issues, then it's easier to see, so maybe really big was a good thing. But one of the things that I like about it is that it's maybe some of you have seen this online. It's the genderbread person. And it's one way of thinking about gender from a variety of different perspectives, not just biology, right? Not just like what parts do you have internally and externally, not just what are your chromosomes, but thinking about biology and your identity, sort of that essence of, the non-scientific element, and then how we express ourselves, right? In terms of our interests, in terms of our dress, in terms of our mannerisms, all those kinds of things. And it's, again, just one way of thinking about gender, but I think it's helpful to understand that it's not just one axis that we're talking about. There's a variety, and that's what makes gender so interesting and what makes it so potentially complicated. And I think it shows the variety of possibilities, right? Why you don't necessarily just see like, a couple of static gender identities, why there's a potentially, range of experiences. So Rachel and I were talking a little bit earlier, and I had said beforehand that when I do this exercise, I usually choose male. Sorry to pick on the males, but I do it for a reason. And Rachel, I don't know if you want to say anything about masculinity with respect to that. But
sure. What I noticed when Gayle asked, how do you know that you're male? People were drawing from many different things. One of them was biology, right? You're drawing from biology. That's how I know that I'm male. Another one was people told me it was the way society treated me, so that's how I knew I was male, right? That was another way. Somebody also said, because of my sexuality, right? Because of my sexuality. That's another thing altogether, right? Who am I attracted to? But all of those things are different concepts. And you can see on the genderbread person, it shows there 3 different things that make up one's gender, like their biological sex, right? So that's one thing that makes up your gender. Your gender identity, that's another thing, how you feel about yourself. And then your gender presentation, how you present yourself. And those are 3 things that make up one's gender, and none of those have to match. We all think that they do, but none of those have to match. There's one thing, if you do have the handout, you're looking at it, one thing that's a little restrictive on there is that it only shows masculinity and femininity. And there's another gender, right, that doesn't include either of those, like androgyny or somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Or agender. Some people identify as agender, meaning not having a gender identity, masculine, feminine, or otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So how you identify as yourself. We were talking about how other people see you and treat you. So that's, like, gender is like a construct. It's what we've made up. The biological part is the physical part that happens, right? Like, we have male and female biology. And then gender is the stuff we all made up. And if anyone has ever said to you, man up, or that's not very ladylike, they're enforcing these rules we've made on gender. And these are just rules, like not everybody fits them, as we found out, but people want to enforce them. And we try to figure out why. Why do we need to know what somebody's gender is, right? We have, our language includes that. Like, we have pronouns, right? Male usually goes by he, him, pronouns. She goes by she, her. So we have to ask, like, are you male or female? Because we want to know what pronouns to use. And it gets complicated because, as you see there's many options. And pronouns are just another one that we just threw in there altogether. Mm-hmm. And those don't have to match either.
I think it's really interesting, Rachel, as you were talking, I was thinking about the enforcement piece and how one of the things that we talk about in my classes at Sac City College is the fact that gender enforcement, if you want to call it that, starts immediately. I mean, it starts right at birth, if not even before birth. I mean, what's the first question that people ask when they find out that someone's pregnant? Mm-hmm. They say, what is it, right? And you think, okay, well, what is it? It's a baby, like, what do you expect? No, what is it is code for, is it a girl or is it a boy, right? Well, why do we want to know the answer to that question? Usually the answer to that question is for our benefit, right? Because if we know that it's a girl or a boy, or if we at least assign it that label, then we can choose paint colors for the room, and we can narrow down certain names, and we can choose clothing and so forth. When I was pregnant with my daughter, my partner and I decided not to find out the gender of our child, which was really interesting because it wasn't all that long ago where you couldn't find out, right? And so now we've sort of swung the other way and people are desperate to find out. And when we were going to prenatal classes, I want to say there were maybe like 15 other couples. We were not the only same-sex couple there, but we were the only couple that had decided not to find out the gender of our child early, which I thought was really interesting. And what was also really interesting to me was that finding clothes for our child that wasn't pink or blue was like impossible. I mean, I thought, my gosh, we're in, the 21st century and this shouldn't be that hard. And no, it was really hard. I mean, every once in a while we'd find like a yellow or green onesie with a turtle on it. I'm serious. I mean, I'm not even joking. And everything else was pink or blue. And honestly, I didn't really care. It's like whatever, if it's clothes and it, like does the job in terms of, giving basic needs to my child, then that's fine. I just thought that was very interesting. It opened up a whole world of gender enforcement that we have in our culture that I think oftentimes isn't all that visible to us. There are even studies looking at adults and how they handle infants. There's one study in particular where adults are presented with an infant and they're not told, well, so the infant was actually a girl, but different groups of adults are told different things about the infant. So like one group is told that it's a girl, another group is told that it's a boy, and then a third group is told nothing about it. And they were asked to choose toys that were appropriate for that infant, and then they were also observed interacting with the infant. And it was probably the interaction piece that was more interesting, because what they found, and there were other studies that were done later to corroborate this, was that babies who were identified as girls tended to be held for longer periods of time, they tended to be soothed more, they tended to be cuddled more, they were held more carefully, right? They were deemed to be a little bit more fragile, whereas the boys, or at least the adults who thought that the baby was a boy, tended to handle it a little more, I hesitate to say roughly, because I don't mean like they were throwing, I mean, they were still like caring for it like a baby, but it wasn't, like there were some interesting and meaningful differences, just by the label, right? It was the same baby, but being treated very differently by adults depending on what they perceived that child's gender to be. So we had also talked a little bit about males in particular, kind of going outside of just like the broad spectrum of gender, and how even with the discussion in our culture about gender and transgender and gender identity and expression and so forth, how that discussion seems to have widened, and yet the expectations for men, cisgender, heterosexual men in our culture, seem to have gotten increasingly narrow, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Even in my own lifetime, I have noticed, in my own lifetime, when I was younger, men were allowed to wear short shorts, right? In the 70s, men could wear those short shorts. If a man would wear shorts that short now, they would be harassed, right? They'd be like, said, no. So, I mean, even now, even things keep getting narrower. But if you go even farther back than my lifetime, men wore lace, men wore wigs and makeup and heels and tights. And that was a form of power, like this is a power thing. As more and more women started wearing them, then like men started making these, like not wearing them, like, well, that's a girl thing over there. So, and so these rules started getting narrow and narrow. It's harder and harder to fit into the roles of masculinity now than it was even when I was younger. And so it's kind of interesting why do we keep narrowing the roles of masculinity, making it harder for men to just be themselves?
I have a theory about that. I don't know if it's right. It could be totally off. So if anybody else has a competing theory, I'd love to hear it. Maybe this is a little bit simplistic, but I think about, and I'm not blaming feminism at all. I am a feminist. I'm a card-carrying feminist, so I'll own that right now. So this isn't a blame game. But what I've noticed is that the more ground that women have gained in society, the more that may feel off limits to males. So like, for example, okay, so like reading, okay? I think the librarians in the room will probably appreciate this. It's probably no secret or any surprise that the majority of children that are labeled as quote unquote reluctant readers tend to be boys, right? Which is interesting. I mean, sometimes you get girls in that category too, but boys are more likely to be given that label, and there's lots and lots of, speculation as to why that is. Is it because boys are, expected to read certain things and that's not what they want to read, or that, comic books and graphic novels don't count, or whatever. I find it interesting that in the United States and in more industrialized countries, more and more girls have become interested in reading, have access to reading, have access to education. When you look at countries where girls are prohibited from reading, reading is like an elite, being able to read is a very elite kind of status. I don't know if this makes sense. It's almost like the more that girls gain ground, the more feminized that arena becomes, and once the feminine label gets slapped on something, boys want nothing to do with it, right? Happens in career fields too, right? Where you start to see women potentially gaining ground in certain career fields and then men potentially retreating as if it's, I don't know, got like the feminine cooties or something. I don't know. That's too simplistic. But I don't know. That's a theory. It's a working theory, so it's still kind of rumbling in my brain. But it's an interesting kind of patterning that I wonder about. I wonder if the limits on masculinity has more to do with the negativity around femininity, if you will, among both males and females, right? That feminine isn't necessarily embraced or, accepted. Even among children, it might be exciting, to think about a girl playing sports. It is exciting to think about a girl playing sports, or a girl doing, gender non-traditional kinds of things. But you think about it the other way, and that's where people tend to get a lot more resistant, right? If they think about a boy playing with dolls, or a boy playing dress up, or a boy doing more domestic types of play, like cooking or playing house or that kind of thing, people tend to have a more visceral reaction, which I find very interesting. And I don't know. I haven't wrapped my head completely around this, but you can tell as I'm rambling that I think about this a lot, and wonder about it, and try to untangle it.
I did have something to say about that, but I lost it.
Okay. I wonder if maybe we want to talk a little bit about transgender, since I imagine that that's probably a big topic that.
Yeah. If nobody already knows, I am transgender. So I was born male, and I transitioned to female. That happened 13 years ago. And so I've been presenting full-time as female for 13 years. So I have kind of a perspective from both sides. I lived 34 years as male, and I got treated male, and I had male privilege, and I had white male privilege because I'm white, and I still am. Right, and you don't realize, like, privilege is a thing you don't realize you have until it's taken away from you. Right? People are like, I'm not privileged. Well, guess what? When you take it away, you're like, oh, that was really helpful to have those things, wasn't it? And so when I transitioned and started to become treated like a woman, it was kind of like a double-edged sword. Like, right? Yes, like, I've made it. Now people are seeing me as a woman and they're treating me that way, but why am I, like, getting doubted now when I say things? And like, I know all about cars, and before I could go to a mechanic and say the starter's broken, and the mechanic would be like, all right, I'll fix that. And now I'll go there and I'll say the starter's broken. They're like, how do you know? Are you sure?
Really?
Yes, I know what a starter is and a carburetor and all those things. But yeah, just the assumptions that we make on people and the roles that we put on people. It's quite interesting. Also, I'm part of technology, so I mean, I work in, I got a degree in networking, and so people don't believe that women would know anything about computers. And I networked, I work at Gender Health Center, I did the whole network there, I put it together, and I had the cable guy coming out just to install the modem, and the cable guy was talking to me. In the middle of me telling him about the network, he goes, is there an IT guy I can talk to? Yeah, me.
Wow.
So yeah, just to have that privilege taken away, I mean, it was like profound to see that. So yeah, I have the insight from both sides, and I've noticed that when I was presenting as male, that people did treat me different, and I did have privileges, but also as women, I got some other things. Like everybody tends to treat women nicer. I don't know what it is. Maybe they think they're less of a threat. But men and women both treat women nicer. I've been treated nicer by both. When I was presenting as male, I don't know, men saw me, I don't know. I wasn't very masculine as a male, so men were threatened by that. And just because I was male, women were threatened by, a man being in the room. So, yeah. So why is that? Why is that? Do you have an idea about why we treat people differently because of their gender, or?
I just think it's so interesting. I don't, off the top of my head. Maybe I'll have another, rambling theory about this. I just find it interesting that men and women who are not transgender sometimes have conversations about differences or privileges that one might have and the other might not have. And yet I think that if we're really going to wrap our heads around gender and understand it, if we started to ask transgender people to tell more of their stories, because you're describing an experience all embodied in your one lived experience, right? People treating you as male and people treating you as female, and having them be radically different, even though you are the same person. And yet people reading you differently and responding differently based on a whole lot of different things, right? Based on upbringing, based on cultural assumptions, based on, gender norms, based on history, I mean, just lots of factors that unconsciously go into people's treatment. I just find that fascinating. And I think that if we were to open up those conversations more, we could learn a whole lot more about gender, and we could learn a whole lot more about sexism too, quite frankly. I think it really opens that up. So I'm grateful that you're willing to share those experiences, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, oh, that's a question. Are we doing questions?
I just wanted to make a comment before I forget it like you did. And it's in response to what you just said. I was a counselor and professor at a community college for 31 years. And I used to work mostly with bicultural, bilingual students at the entry level, teaching them how to succeed in college. And one of the things that I used to use as a basis to give them more confidence was to say, all of you that are bilingual are twice as smart as the monolingual students. So think of it that way, that you're bringing a whole new perspective to your academic work here, because you can read, write, and think in two different languages, and you have the experience of two different cultures. So when I heard you say that, it brought back that kind of memory to me that you're twice as smart in terms of the experience that you've had, because you've just given us a brand new look at what a transgender person goes through in terms of their experience. So I really appreciate what you shared with us.
Rachel's pretty smart anyway, so.
Yeah, but knowing that, having that privilege, having that male privilege, and having that taken away from me, really, I can't help but be a feminist, right? Because now, why don't I have that same respect that I had before? Like, why don't women get that same respect that men get? There's hands everywhere.
Yeah, totally.
Oh,
she was commenting, she was commenting on her, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I misstate what you shared, but she was commenting on the fact that she'd worked at a community college for a number of years with bilingual students, and thought about the fact that students who are truly bilingual are that much smarter and that much more flexible linguistically than those of us who are monolingual. And she was kind of making a comparison, kind of using that as a metaphor. Is that fair to say? I'm actually really glad. I'm going to take your comment and sort of run with it in a slightly different direction. I'm glad that you brought up, I'm really interested in the fact that you were at a community college, because I teach at a community college. And I have to say that working with the LGBT community there, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and all the other initials that can potentially go with it, most of the work that we've had to do in terms of advocating for students has lately been on behalf of transgender students, because the systems and structures that are set up at the college are based on a two-gender system, right? It's based on the idea that there's male and there's female and there's nothing else. And it's also based on the assumption that whatever you look like, you are, right? And so there's been a whole lot of work that we've been doing at the college to try to dismantle that, and it is unbelievable. All the way down, and it's amazing just how much work it is to try to get people to understand that no, it's not just two, and no, there really need to be other options for students to identify with, and students really need to have the opportunity to change their name or identify their pronouns or change their gender on whatever college records they have. They need to be able to do that reasonably easily. And in some cases, it is not so hard. In other cases, it is incredibly hard. I have just a quick example. I have a colleague who was working at the college for quite some time and is no longer working there, not so much because of this issue, but because of other issues. And she's transgender. And our email at the college is our last name and then our first initial, but then in parentheses, it says our full name, right? And so she wanted that to be changed, right? Like she wanted her given name, her birth name, not to be on there, and she wanted the name that she goes by to be listed there. So that didn't, long story short, that did not get solved during the time that she was there. It required all sorts of conversations with college IT people and then district level IT people, and conversations about the, just the what kinds of database changes. I mean, it was just like, you'd think that we were asking them to like lasso the moon and bring it in, bring it down to earth, which maybe they were. You're the IT expert. I am not. I tend to think that, totally, right. Like maybe it takes a little bit more of this, but whatever this it takes, it should be a doable thing, right? That's just one example. And I think about our transgender students and how many times over the course of their educational experience they have to go through things like that when they're interacting with systems that are not set up to welcome them as they are, right, in terms of their gender identity, expression, presentation, and so forth, which is why I'm so grateful that the Gender Health Center is here in town, because I think it's such a wonderful resource, not just to individuals, but also to organizations and to businesses and to agencies in town, you know, all of these entities that have these structures that need to be challenged in some ways and need to be shifted or dismantled or changed or, you know, tweaked or whatever the case may be. Because it's a tremendous amount, I just see it in the students, it's a tremendous amount of energy, trying to anticipate where the problems are going to be, trying to head it off at the start, trying to find allies in the process to be able to help them. And all the while, in order to do that, they have to come out, right? And that's a very dangerous thing, because they are not depending on what entity you're talking about, they're not necessarily a protected class, if you will. They are in California for the most part, but again, protection, you know, discrimination can happen on so many different levels. It may not necessarily be an overt kind of thing. So it's a challenging thing for them to come out, but I just think about that a lot. So that's part of, I know you were talking about something totally different, but when you said community college, it got me thinking about all the systems that are set up in our culture that just presume that gender is male and female and that's it, and don't necessarily go deeper into the larger conversation. I don't know if you have anything you want to add or share just from the Gender Health Center perspective.
Well, since we've transitioned from talking about gender in general and talking about transgender, I got a lot to say about that.
Go for it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that, we don't even think about. Like as a trans person, you know, things about gender. I transitioned on the job before I got my job at Gender Health Center, which is a great job because I can be open about being trans, which is fantastic. But I worked at a sign company before. And I transitioned on that job, and I didn't know how to come out. Like I didn't tell them for 6 months. I was taking hormones, and my body was changing, but I was trying to hide it with big baggy shirts, and eventually somebody did notice. But I mean, how do you tell them, and how are they going to react? It's a thing that goes through your mind all the time. Like you don't want to be rejected or lose your job. So I went through that, and when I finally told my boss, he was like, "Oh yeah, no problem." And so that was kind of a shocker, but I had the support at work, and so I transitioned at work. And I worked there for another 3 years until I got laid off. And now I have to find a new job. I worked in the graphic art field for 20 years, so I had all this experience. But when I get my new job, do I use that experience? Are they looking now? They'll be looking for a different name and gender. Are they going to know that's me? Am I outing myself as trans to the next employer? Like, do I not have the experience? All kinds of things that come up that I didn't even think about that, you know, related to gender. As it came through, so like, why is that? Like, and also like, women get paid less. So now, right? So now I get to do the same job I've been doing for 20 years and get paid less for it. Like, wow, what's up with that? So yeah, and so it's really interesting thinking about all these concepts of gender and how they relate to trans people. Back when we made gender, right, we made this binary, we decided, and we based it on genitals. We based it on genitals when we made gender. And as humans, we like to simplify things to make things easy, right? So how do we decide how many genders there are? Well, let's go with, there's a penis, there's a vagina, there's 2 genders. But the concept of more than that has been around for a long time. The Native Americans had what they call Two-Spirit, which were people that lived in the middle. Many tribes had many different concepts of gender, more than 2. Many had like a concept of 4 genders, and some had even more than that. And when colonization came over, and their ideas and their beliefs came in, they said, "You can't do that anymore. There's only 2, and this is the way we're going to do it." And so that happened as we colonized the United States. We reduced our ideas on gender there. It happened in Hawaii. Hawaii also has a group of people called the Mahu who live in the middle. And the difference is those people were revered, both the Native Americans and Hawaii. They're revered as scholars, as teachers. Like what you just said, like I know it from both sides. Like, so I know a little bit more than everybody else does. So they saw it that way, and they revered them that way. Even in Mexico, the same thing. So all around, there was ancient cultures that had more than 2 genders, but we've decided that we only need the 2, and we restricted them. But now we're finding out, guess what? There is more than 2. There's way more than the 2 that we try to restrict them to. Mm-hmm. So why are we still fighting those gender rules that we've restricted to the 2 genders that we've we know that there's more.
Well, not only are there more than two genders, I think a good argument can be made for the idea that there are more than two biological sexes, right? So if we're just going down to biology. There's a great book that just came out, a memoir called Born Both. Look it up and read it. It's really good. It's written by a woman by the name of Hida Valoria. She identifies as a woman. She identifies as an intersex woman. And intersex, for people who are unfamiliar, are people who, for purely biological reasons, whether it is chromosomes or sex hormones, genitalia, what have you, internal reproductive organs, external reproductive organs, et cetera, are not 100% biologically male or 100% biologically female. So the term that I think that may be more familiar to some folks is hermaphrodite, which is a term that I personally don't love. It sort of conjures up like the freak show at the circus kind of thing, which is why a lot of people in the intersex community have moved away from that. Although there are some that have claimed it and, have, just appropriated it for themselves and used it as a term of empowerment. But I wouldn't recommend that just sort of in general. And when you look at the numbers of babies that are born intersex, not 100% biologically male, 100% biologically female, we're talking about roughly 1 in 200. I mean, it's a fairly common sort of thing. It's more common than Down syndrome. It's more common than having red hair. So I know red hair has become less and less common over the years, but it's a very common phenomenon. I think part of the reason why it doesn't get talked about quite as much is because oftentimes babies get operated on if their genitals are visibly not male or not female, and then labeled a girl or a boy, and then, that's how that goes. There are horrific stories about people who have had that happen to them, and the gender label and the surgery that they got was wrong, and so they've grown up questioning their gender identity their whole lives, and also wondering what happened to them, and then finding out after the fact that their bodies were operated on without their consent, because obviously babies can't give consent. There are other folks who are intersex because, but they don't realize it until maybe later, like maybe in adolescence is when it starts to raise awareness. Maybe their genitalia looks male or looks female, probably more likely to look female, depending on which intersex condition you're talking about. But puberty causes their bodies to change in a way that's different than someone who's not intersex, right? But it's not talked about very much. And so there's plenty of people who may potentially be intersex but not know about it because of the gender label they received at birth. There are other people who may know quite well that they're intersex, but there's not a large cultural language to talk about it, and so there's not really room to share that identity with other people and be understood in a way that's empowering. But it's fairly common. And it can intersect with transgender, right? Like they're separate but potentially overlapping, if that makes sense. So it's still there, but yet our, at least our medical community still operates literally and figuratively. I can't believe I just said operates. Literally and figuratively operates on the idea that there's male and female and that's it. And if for whatever reason, if you're born differently than that, we're going to make you one or the other, right? Like that's just been kind of the common medical understanding. There's been some changes happening in the medical community around that, but it's slow, right? It's taken quite some time, and it's taken a tremendous amount of advocacy.
Yes, I actually know a few people who are born intersex, and they've had a surgery performed on them, and they were like, why is it bad? Like, just because it doesn't conform to what you say male and female should be, whatever it is that I had, it worked,
right.
and I would have rather just had that,
right,
than you decide what I should have as genitalia.
Right. There's nothing medically wrong with them. They just were different or didn't fit into whatever that that category was. Actually, in Born Both, Hida, when she tells her story, not to totally spoil it because there's a whole lot more than this, but she was not operated on. She was one of the few that, and her genitalia is like clearly not one or the other, right? Like it's somewhere in between kind of thing. And her father was a doctor and knew something about intersex and was able to advocate and prevent that surgery from happening. But that's much more the exception rather than the norm. And I totally agree with what Rachael just said. If there's nothing physically or medically wrong with a child, why not just let it be what it is? What most intersex activists advocate for is the idea that you not operate, right? Like you let the child be who they are. Many of them advocate for the idea of assigning a gender label, but also informing them about their intersex condition in age-appropriate terms, not keeping it a secret, not, preventing them from getting information. And in that event, if for whatever reason the gender label is wrong, a change can be made, right? Like there can be some flexibility. At a fairly early age, there could be some conversation about that too. I mean, kids at a pretty early age, they know what their gender identity is, right? You can ask, a kid who can talk can tell you if they're a girl or a boy. And what's really interesting, research is starting to show this, that if you ask a transgender child who's maybe 2 or 3 years old, what are you? Are you a girl or a boy? They will say the gender that they identify with. It doesn't necessarily conform to what their body is, right? And that's become a fairly consistent finding that I've seen in the research, which is fascinating. It fits with a lot of the cognitive developmental research and psychology that's been done over the last few decades on gender. The kids understand gender at a pretty early age. Conforming to gender norms tends to come a little bit later, right? That comes with more interaction with other kids and with families and with teachers and school and society and all those kinds of things. So we got a little bit of the high sign. I wonder if, is it time for questions thereabout? Do people have questions? Do people want to come up to the mic and you have a question? Come on up.
So this question's for Rachael. I work here at the library. And my son, he has always presented at a very early age with identifying with girl things, only wants girl toys. And he's even asked me the question when he was 6. He's now 8 at 6, Mommy, why'd you make me this way? Why'd you pick? Yeah. So me and his father have struggled over the years with whether or not just to let him go, try and, put him in a box. How do you, do that? And since I'm, you're here, I just kind of want to know, guidance in that direction. We get him whatever he likes. There's Frozen posters all over the place, but, we dress him, he has all the Barbies, he has all the toys, but we dress him as a boy. We present him as a boy. And, all those questions have kind of faded, but I've always wondered if I'm, stunting it in a way. So.
No, it sounds like you said you're being supportive, like Frozen stuff, right? Giving him whatever he wants. That's perfect. That's the best way to do it, is to be supportive. And it doesn't always, maybe they're not trans. Maybe they are. My best friend, who I've known since high school, has raised a few kids, 2 males, and both of them got to play with Barbies all the time. They played with Barbies, but they're not trans. They're straight males right now. So supporting that didn't change their own identity, but not supporting it is hurtful to that person. But just support it, and they'll either be, they'll either grow up to be a straight man that likes to play with Barbies or played with Barbies when they were a kid, or maybe they find out that they are trans, and they'll let you know if they don't want to wear boy clothes anymore. They'll let you know. They'll let you know. So yeah, I think you're doing the right thing. Mm-hmm.
My turn? Okay, so this is kind of a little bit more of a niche question. I am autistic, and I would consider myself something of an autistic advocate, and recently there's been some talk in the autistic community about terms such as neurogender, and I was just kind of wondering what are your thoughts on the matter, because it's not something I know that much about, and I know a lot of autistic people feel that that autism affects how they think of their gender, and I was wondering what your thoughts on the matter are.
I probably know about as much about that as you do. Most of my knowledge is anecdotal. I don't know. Anecdotal evidence is always challenging, right?
Yeah.
Because whoever's in your orbit is where you're getting your information, and my orbit is different than everybody else's orbit. But I have seen at Sac City College, where I teach, so we see more autistic students, right? Yeah. Students with autism. Like that just goes with the statistics that you see nationwide. And I have noticed that quite a few...
identity first, by the way.
Just say that again?
I use identity first, by the way.
Okay.
Just like FYI.
Autistic identity? Or...
So I'm an autistic person, not a person with autism.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've heard some of that too. Actually, I came across a nasty Twitter back and forth
That's
about
fun.
that. Yes. Yeah. So thank you for what your preference is. anyway, I have noticed more autistic students saying that, presenting with a variety of different gender identities that are not necessarily male or female, right? Whether it is transgender, genderqueer, agender, whole bunch of different things. I don't know what to make of that. I think that there's a possibility that there's an intersection. I don't know. That's one of those things that as a psychologist and as a scientist and all those sorts of things, like I'd want to learn more before drawing a conclusion. I find it interesting. I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Oh, yeah, I'd say like the same as you. Like I've noticed the same thing. I've noticed a lot of trans people I know also have identify with autism. Many of them, a lot bigger number than when I didn't know so many trans people. And same thing is I've also noticed artistic as well. A lot of my trans friends have some kind of artistic ability as well, like either drawing or singing or. And I don't know if it's related. Like I said, it's all just what I've noticed, and I haven't done a study, but I mean, it seems to me like they might be related. Somehow there's like intersection. There's probably an intersection somewhere. But.
I mean, I'm sure that there's an intersection, but it's interesting if it goes beyond an intersection in some ways. But thank you. I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I feel comfortable saying that there's a coexistence, possibly an intersection. It's hard to say whether it's cause and effect. I always, it's always dangerous, if you've ever taken stats, and I'm sorry for those of you that are terrified of stats, I love that stuff. But you hear over and over again, correlation is not causation. Just because two things happen simultaneously doesn't always mean one causes the other, but they might, right? So it's certainly worth investigating. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I watched a show called Gender Revolution, Katie Couric, and it just really changed a lot about me. And I had a feminine side to me for years. I have 4 children. I'm bisexual. I'm married. And I saw Gavin Grimm, and I was totally blown away by Gavin Grimm and his story and what was going on with him and about the challenges, him wanting to use the bathroom of his identity. And so here I am, and all of a sudden I find out I'm transgender. And so I started transitioning about November. And so I'm just going through this. But now I'm in these same situations. I have to carefully plan where I go because I have to use a single stall bathroom. I'm not comfortable anywhere else.
Yeah.
And so I have to find those bathrooms. And I'll tell you, people think, well, it's a big deal. Well, you know what? If you got to go, you got to go.
It's a big deal.
And I mean, I see people, most people are really positive. But I get Snickers, and I get this, and I get that, and so it's the real world. And I'm full-time out as transgender 24/7. So I just want to make that comment that this is real stuff. I mean, what people go through. And like I said in the beginning, I was sympathizing, and now I'm there. Thank you.
Yeah, the bathroom thing's a big issue, of course. A lot of people are afraid to use the bathroom with a trans person, but what they don't know is they've been using a bathroom with a trans person for a long time.
Yeah, this is very elucidating. Of course, the bathroom issue has been around and up front a lot, but I was really fascinated when you said about your career and what the heck you do when you have a whole resume with a certain name. I don't know if you changed both first and last name. You did?
Not at first. I got married to change my last name.
Oh, okay, right. So, but what do you advise people to do? What do people do if they have a whole body of work, and then they change their name and they're like maybe in their 20s or 30s, and they want to take advantage of that whole career that they've had? I guess the first thing they have to do is explain. Now this is my name, so I'm transgender, I've transitioned, my name and career were this, and now they're that, and that's why my resume looks different and I'm interviewing with a different name. I guess that's one of the very first things that you talk about, right?
Yeah. It would be great to be able for people to be comfortable enough to say I'm trans and not worry about what the person's going to do. There are protections in California that say you cannot fire someone because they're trans or their gender identity or their gender presentation. But how do you know? Like, how do you know somebody didn't hire you because you were trans? How do you prove that?
Right.
right? So, I mean, it's still there. It still exists even though there's protections. And even though there are policies now for changing names and changing all the paperwork, you can change your school records to the new name. But I mean, like when they call up to do a reference, like how you tell all your old bosses to use your old name, eventually someone's going to find out when they do when they trace you. So.
Just one thing, but a major one.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a friend recently that I work with who's a part-time faculty member who is transitioning and identifies as female, but others have identified this individual as male for quite some time. And so this person is looking for full-time employment as a community college professor and is putting her applications out there and came to me, and I don't know and didn't know this person well, but she was coming to me wanting advice because of that very situation. She was applying and she obviously was giving her work history and she needed to list references and provide letters of rec. And she's like, like if I do this, I'm probably gonna have to come out because, they know me as a man and the people that are hiring me are gonna, know me as a woman, and for them to find out that way when they're doing reference checks is weird, but I don't know if I want to be out to them. And so it just was, in our case, it was more just a conversation of, like trying to gauge what felt right to this person, because I agree, ideally it would be great if, she could be herself and be open and be out to everybody and have it not be a big deal. She was perceiving that to her previous employer it could be a big deal, and it probably would have been a big deal. So she's had to make some decisions accordingly, which is really unfortunate and problematic.
Just one of the many dilemmas.
Yeah, right.
Thank you.
Hello.
I'm going to address a couple different comments. First of all, in regards to gender, there's a whole, I like baseball. Oh, really? Name all the teams in the National League East. I've had that happen. But obviously, as you can see, gender presentation, I tend to do more guyish. And, there's a lot of times where I wish I was a boy, although I'm not mentally totally, I'm cool with being a girl. But then again, when I was kids, me and my cousins, they'd be the princesses, I'm the king. I didn't want to be the queen, that was stupid, I want to be king. So, it's one of those things I've been struggling with, and I'm not sure where I fit on that big blobby mess. Yeah. So, and I've been lucky in some senses. I've been thinking about, I grew up in a relatively conservative area of California, but I'm thinking about it, they encouraged my interest in baseball. My parents have been great, and even in high school, I was never, you can't do math. The chief math teacher was this little spark of a woman from Georgia, and everybody was afraid of her. So anyway, it's not really a question, it's just kind of my thoughts, and, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be great if you didn't have to pick between just the two, right?
Right, yeah.
Male and female.
Or even, clothes shopping. I'm looking for a job too. You've got to dress up. What? Dude, can I put on a suit? That would be easier. You should be able to put on whatever clothes you want. Yeah.
And whatever, if you like baseball and dresses, that should be fine.
Yeah, but as I said, even in the workforce, it's like, I'd feel more comfortable in just, that I could go and it's like, okay, I can put on a suit and a tie, everything's cool, instead of, I wear this and I have to wear that, and oh God, I have to go shopping and...
Yeah, and may I ask which pronouns you use for yourself?
Girl, yeah, she.
She and her pronouns?
Yeah, it's just something, I've always been kind of done that, that's just the way it, by the time I realized there was more than one option, I've just become used to the one I have.
Yeah. Yeah, so yes, I've noticed we do a lot of boards that have gender identities on them when we go to events, and we ask what is your gender identity, male, female, and we have all these options, and one of them is just me, and you'd be surprised at how full that just me is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one more thought on this too. I have PCOS, so that's a condition, lots of cysts on your ovaries, mm-hmm. and it messes with your hormones. People with PCOS happen to have a lot more testosterone. Mm-hmm. I grow a beard, even though being a girl, having the girl parts, so again, it's, in the wintertime, especially when I've got my big jacket on and the hat, and I haven't necessarily shaved in a couple of days. Have a good day, sir. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so anyway, just figured a few stories like that would also, and also fitting in and yeah, that all.
Thank you
Well,
for
thank you.
sharing.
Thank you.
This is primarily, well, as a statement to the audience. Rachel, you shared some of the challenges of transitioning, and I have a good friend who's transitioned, and it becomes so subtle that things you wouldn't even think about. For instance, she transitioned to female. However, she had been a bowler as a man, and so when she was very afraid because, in general, men bowl, have higher scores, are more proficient at bowling than women. And so she joined a women's group, because that's her identification, and lived in fear that they would find out that she had been a man, because she, with some frequency, gets 300 scores. And how now does the other genders identify with that? You know, oh, we've got a man over here who's taking all the trophies. And it's just a subtlety that never occurred to me. So, you know, I welcome you to share more of those. I mean, there were stories she shared with me about not feeling safe, where she would be out as a man at 2 in the morning and walk a long ways to her car, but was fearful to do that as a woman. So that's your privilege comments reminded me of that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and it is quite interesting in sports how we try to enforce those rules. I mean, there's a thing that just happened recently with a trans guy who was playing on the women's team, and they said that that wasn't fair to the women, and so then he had to play on the other team, and then it's not fair to them, and it's like, well, then which team do I play on?
Yeah, the NCAA, the Collegiate Athletic Association, has some pretty clear guidelines that I think are pretty forward-thinking for an athletics organization around transgender students or transgender athletes and the teams that they play on and so forth. That said, it's one thing to have the standards and the guidelines. It's another thing to have the implementation, right? And so that's sometimes an issue. And the NCAA doesn't govern everything, right? So some of you may have heard about the controversy around Caster Semenya, who is a South African track star. I can't remember exactly what events she participates in, but there have been some questions about her gender identity, particularly if she's intersex, and she's been asked to take hormone, to go through a chromosomal test or hormone test or whatever, and she has refused. And she keeps winning these medals, right? And there's questions about, okay, well, is she really a woman or is she really a man? And should she be competing with the women and so forth? And if you think about it, it's really, number one, it takes away just from their athletic ability, right? Like the fact that they're, training so hard and doing what they're doing. But it also shows how the way that we construct gender really doesn't create, there's a lot of people that end up, with no place to go, right? Like they're not going to feel like they belong anywhere. It's really challenging for them to feel accepted in any of those realms.
I have 2 questions. The first is for my own edification. When does someone realize that they are transgender and want to have the other sexual manifestations? Does it happen just at any time, or is there a specific time frame when people start to realize they want to be something else?
I know a lot of trans people, and they begin their transition at multiple times. I guess it all depends on I don't know what it depends on. I think there's a lot more younger people now because it's there, it's visible, they know about it. There's an internet where they can look stuff up. So a lot of younger people now know about transgender. When I was younger, I didn't even know what it was or what it meant or what to do or that there was anybody else that felt that way. And so I think the internet's opened that up to younger people realizing that they're trans. But yeah, I've heard a lot of stories of people with their 3-year-old saying that I'm not a boy and I'm a girl, and so people know at a very early age what their gender is. They identify with one of the genders that we've made, like this is what boys do and this is what girls do, and they're like, well, I want to do what you say girls do. That's how I identify. They may not know who they're attracted to. They don't know about sex yet, but they know what their gender is. But yeah, I don't know. I think, for me, I was doing things when I was in junior high. I started like dressing. I didn't know what that meant. Because I didn't know what trans was. So it took me until I was 36 to finally, the internet came around when I was 36, and I'm in my 30s, and I'm like, oh look, there's other trans people. What do you do? What did you do? So I don't know. I think the internet's made it easier for younger people to realize that they're trans than there used to be. So and a lot of people are like, where are all these trans people coming from? Like, we've been here. They just they just didn't know. Yeah.
Well, and I think there's a difference between like having a sense of your gender identity versus having a sense of what's possible for you. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to, Rachel. The idea that if you don't have a language for transgender, then it's going to be hard to really own that as an identity and, move towards making a gender transition. The other issue that complicates it is that different people transition differently, right? Like everyone's transition can look very different from one another. There's lots of different choices that people can make in terms of what feels right for them. I don't know if this is a fair comparison, but I'll use it anyway. And that is, again, I'm not trans, but I do identify as queer. I am same-sex attracted, and I have been in relationships with people who are not female in the past as well. And that really, I didn't get enlightened onto that until I was pretty well into college. And I think the reason for that was just it was not talked about, and if it was talked about in a really negative way. I mean, I grew up in the height of the AIDS crisis and a very conservative suburban town, and I don't know, there was something about being in a different environment and meeting different people where it was like, oh, this is what's going on for me. And then that gives me a whole opportunity to re-explain my whole life story. For sure.
That was very helpful. Now, the second question has to do with the intersex babies. I'm a medical doctor, and I worked in a large medical center where I had the opportunity to witness 2 such births. And in both instances, both were assigned the female gender. Mm-hmm. This is back in the 60s. When I asked, why?
I bet I know why.
The answer was very peculiar. The answer was because it is easier
exactly.
for adaptation as a female in our world. And I thought, really?
Well, it's easier to construct genitalia surgically.
But my question,
I don't know if it's easier in terms of adaptation.
My question now is, has the thinking, I haven't kept up, I'm retired, has that thinking changed now? You brought up the fact that later they grow up and say, well, how dare they assign me this gender? Right. I didn't want this.
And then they have to transition.
Has that thinking changed? Right. Do they do nothing now? Do they just not assign gender now and maybe wait later, or what is it?
Well, it's hard to say. I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not in that arena. The sense that I get from talking with people who I know are in that field is that there is some advocacy that's happening. I mean, there's some awareness. There's some guidelines that the intersex community, along with a group of medical practitioners, developed, kind of best practices, if you will, for working with intersex babies and their families, in terms of what an appropriate, course of action might look like. Whether that's common practice, I don't know. I honestly don't think that we're there yet. I think it's still, it's really sad, but, and I think part of it is that even today, it's amazing even in my classes when we start talking about intersex identities. When I first put that word out and I ask students, have you ever heard of this word before? Maybe I'll get one student, maybe I'll get a couple, but most of the time I get nobody. And then I tell them about this, and it's like a rock your world experience. Like they look at me like, like I just made their brains explode, and now they're trying to reconfigure them with this new sort of reality. Mm-hmm. And that's today, right? So,
yeah. Thank you both.
Hi.
Hi.
So I'm just curious, for those of us in the audience who are cisgendered, what are some of the things that we, just our own lens, unintentionally communicates things that are hurtful, or like this isn't a safe space for transgendered individuals, and what are some things we can do to intentionally communicate this is a safe space, or you are fully embraced or fully loved?
Oh, those are really good questions.
That's a very good question.
But it's hard to answer. It depends on the individual. Different people are comfortable with different things. But in general, doing things like having a gender-neutral bathroom, a simple thing like a gender-neutral bathroom will make a trans person very comfortable, because we talked about bathrooms, right? It's tough as a trans person. When a trans person doesn't fit the male or female, they don't want to use either bathroom because they know they're going to get harassed if they go in either bathroom. So just to have a gender-neutral bathroom is one thing that makes them feel comfortable. And then even asking, like if you see somebody whose presentation is kind of gender neutral, to ask, like I asked that one person, like what their pronouns are. You can tell them yours, like my name is Rachel, my pronouns are she, her, and hers. How about you? Those are some things that you can make people feel comfortable with. I don't know, like I guess just the one thing that you don't want to do is enforce a binary with people. Like I've heard people say, like, why can't you just be more manly? Like if you want to be a man, like. So like, don't enforce those gender rules that we've made up.
I think the most common thing that I hear at the college in talking with faculty and staff is like a well-intentioned fear, right? Like the biggest fear that I hear lately is, oh my gosh, I don't want to use the wrong pronoun, or I don't want to use the wrong name, or I don't want to mess it up. And so asking is one way to get that information. I will say that at my college, it's complicated. Again, we're going back to antiquated databases and data collecting and so forth. But on the first day of class, I get a list of the students' names on the roster. And some students know that they can include a preferred name on their application. Some students don't know. So there are cases where I may have a name on there that they wish not to be called for whatever reason, whether they're trans or not. So I usually send an email out a few days before class starts, just introducing myself, giving them like the lay of the land, just, a lot of things. And then also saying, if there's a name that you prefer that I use instead, please let me know, and I'll make a note of that. Usually I find that transgender students that are reading their email will jump on that and then let me know. But I also find that if I make a mistake, and it happens, and I'm not proud of it, but it's reality, if I can apologize and just move on and make sure that I make the correction and not make like a huge big deal out of it, that's better, right? If I go into this, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, and I totally misgendered you, and I used the wrong pronoun, the wrong name, it's like, oh my God, really just get over yourself. Like get me out of the spotlight, just make the correction and move on, and at that point it's damage control. And I try not to, like I always am trying to be aware and self-corrective, but if I do slip up like that, I try not to beat myself up too bad. And I don't mean that in a way of I just let myself off the hook. I mean it in a way of beating myself is not productive. Like that's not going to help move forward. It's just a point of awareness of, oh, okay, it happened. I'm going to do my best to make sure that that doesn't happen again. Yeah, I think that there's little things can go a long way. The bathrooms, I agree, make a huge difference. Just seeing that is a sign that, okay, there's awareness and there's been some forethought, and this is a place where I'm potentially welcome, for sure. It doesn't just have to be bathrooms, but I think that's a good example.
Hi, I'm a professional editor and a proofreader, and I find the gender-neutral writing is really, really difficult, and I know that the trend has been to use they instead of he or she, but that just creates confusion because you're talking about the traditional sense where there's more than one person, or the new sense where it's an individual. So I was just curious, what are the other options out there? I usually just rewrite the sentence so you don't need a pronoun. But I mean,
I think they is a lot better than the other options, quite frankly.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I'm just
the other
curious.
Options are kind of clunky. I mean, there's Z and a bunch of, there's other gender neutral pronouns, but I think that people are more likely to look at them and be like, what's that?
Right, yeah, and just saying he/she is also limiting because
it's binary.
Right,
because it's binary. But they, them is the acceptable ones to use. But like you're saying, like people say, well, are you referring to one person or multiple people? But I think the more we use it, the more people will get it. And we already do that. I mean, I give a perfect example. Like if you're talking on the phone to somebody and they're like, oh my gosh, I was at the DMV and the clerk was really rude to me. I can't believe what the clerk said to me. And you're like, I don't know that clerk's gender identity. So you're like, oh my gosh, what did they say? Right? And you're talking about that one clerk, but you just used the they, them pronoun.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true. Well, thank you.
I think embracing change with language is a good thing. And I know that I'm probably speaking heresy to, some of the writers and librarians and English people, but I always think about the fact that if language never changed, we'd all be speaking Middle English.
That's right.
Hi. That's kind of weird because I'm an editor too. Like, how many of us are in this room? No.
We're in a library, there's a lot of words here, word people gravitate to that.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about gender fluidity in one person. Our kid is, she's herself, and we've brought out the genderbread person. Every year I bring it out and say, okay, Joe, here's this is this, this is this, this is this. Where are you right now? And sometimes I hear from the trans community, oh, she's going to end up trans. Or people assume that she is trans. But we, her dad and I, like to just go, she is who she is right at this moment. So I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
I think that's awesome, frankly.
Yeah, gender fluidity can appear in either their identity or their presentation, like maybe their identity never changes, maybe your child identifies as female, but maybe their presentation changes. Or maybe it is their identity. Maybe their identity also changes, more masculine some days and more feminine other days. And you're doing the right thing by asking, right? Like if somebody's gender is fluid and it changes from day to day, they can't expect you to know what it is every day. You can't expect to know how somebody's feeling. So it's great to ask. Like that's great to say. Like maybe like what pronouns shall I use to refer to you today?
We do it. She hates talking about it, so I just say, Joe, we do this once a year. It's for me. Please, just gut it out. Yeah. I think she identifies currently as a lesbian who looks like a gay boy.
That's a thing, so,
Yeah.
That's a thing, yeah.
Before we go on, Rachel and I have been tasked with tracking the time, but I have no idea what time it is.
Is that clock right out there?
I don't know. So we're good. Okay. I'm just realizing I was given a job, the one job that I'm given to do, and I'm not finding the tool I need to do my job.
Hey, I wanted to say, so I grew up in a very conservative home, as well as I grew up in Seattle area, a religious home. Still consider myself very religious. And my question for you guys, I really do appreciate your insights, because that's something that I've been trying to align with, and without trying to enforce my beliefs onto other people as well. I think that's very important, that everyone should be able to feel loved, welcomed, and safe and secure. And so I appreciate those insights first off. But I did want to ask you, what do you guys recommend for first off, from my understanding, I believe there is definitely a difference between gender as one feels and the biological sex. And I do believe that biological sex is very important. And there are cases, as we said, that where, honestly, it could be a choice in that matter. But how do we not lose where that identity, I think, whether if it's not something that they want to adhere to or adhere to the cultural norms surrounding that identity, and I totally agree with that. I think that's that we've created. Yet, how do we not forsake the biological identity and completely, but we can still use that in our society as an important element, yet how one dresses, how one acts, that really is a decision, and we can't judge that. But I fear that we're moving in a way that is disconnecting the biological element of it. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I think there's a lot more that we don't know biologically than we do know biologically. And what I mean by that is that, like we know the parts, we know the anatomical and all of that, we know about reproduction and so forth. When I say we, I mean like the collective scientific we, not just we in the room, but people who are doing research on this, haven't got a handle at all in terms of how those biological factors impact the brain and how our brain affects our identity, or affects any number of things, how it affects our gender identity, how it affects our personality, how it affects our sexual orientation, et cetera. And it's hard to get at because, some folks will say, oh, well, you can do a brain scan. Okay, well, you can do a brain scan, but what's that going to tell you? It's not going to tell you like how hormones and neurotransmitters and other kinds of things are, interacting or affecting one another, or modifying different areas of the brain. It's such a new area that I think that scientists are really starting to realize how little they know in terms of gender and sex, rather than how much they know. So I realize that probably doesn't answer your question, but I feel like maybe it creates a context for your question, in that I don't think there is a real simple answer, because when we talk about losing that biological aspect, I don't think scientists really have a clear idea at all in terms of how biology truly affects our gender identity. I think for so many years, people have assumed that gender and sex are just the same thing, and then that's the end of that, right? Like your biology is your reality, and then boom, and now people are realizing, oh, it's more complicated than that. Some of that probably has to do with the brain. Some of that may have to do with other functions in the body. Some of it, who knows, right? Unfortunately, I'm not sure that there's enough researchers that are out there that are disentangling all of this stuff. And that's a funding issue, right? Just in terms of being able to get funding to do that kind of thing. But I think that just even thinking at all about how the biological affects one's identity, period, is a very complicated question that we barely started to scratch the surface on. That's just kind of my feeling about it.
Okay. Because when I talk about biology, it's quite interesting. They used to think that the chromosomes were the sole deciders of what your genitalia was going to be. If you have an XX chromosome, you're going to have a vagina. If you have XY chromosomes, you're going to have a penis. And they've discovered that that's not always the case.
There's like 100 different steps between chromosomes to birth.
Yeah, and so really those chromosomes they thought solely decided what your gender was. That's not their only job. That's one of their jobs. So they could have, the chromosomes can be different than they think they're going to be. And so even that biology we thought was very strict is not. They've also discovered that there's, and then I'm not a brain scientist, so I don't know where it is, but women, there's a part of a woman's brain that is bigger than that same part in a man's brain. And they've noticed that people who are trans people.
That's the
hypothalamus. Thank you, Dr. Pitman.
It's actually like a little part of the hypothalamus, and it's got this long name, and I won't bore you with that. Anyway, It's a tiny little part of the brain.
But they're also seeing that people who are transgender, before they've had any hormones, if they identify as women, that brain looks more like the cisgender women's brain. And so there's different parts of the biology that are not as strict as we thought they were. So even the biology is a little bit mixed in. So I don't know if that helps or makes it more confusing.
No, I mean, it gives me context, like you guys said, so thank you very much.
We're good at complicating questions instead of answering them.
Hi. I just wanted to first thank you guys both for doing this, just because as somebody who's been interested in gender and sex for a long time, and I read a fair amount on the subject, I've taken classes, I spend a lot of time on the internet exploring this stuff, I've noticed that there has been kind of a slow but steadily moving trajectory that I've noticed in for people who are in this field of exploring gender and sexuality to be, to get frustrated or feel offended or be angry and judgmental easily when when the general public doesn't immediately understand their experience or where they're coming from. And I just think it's super important to have really open conversations, because I think there's a lot of obviously, there's a lot of members of the general public that this is new for them and they don't understand, but they're open and they want to learn. That's why I thought that Katie Couric's gender revolution was a pretty positive thing. So I just want to thank you guys for doing that, and also ask whether the Gender Health Center, do you guys have any like classes or anything that are just open to the public who maybe aren't trans, don't have the experience, but are just curious and want to learn? Or is that something you guys?
Sometimes we do workshops. It's not really very often, but we'll do workshops that talk about gender. They have usually specific subjects on it, like youth and stuff, but we'll do workshops. Also, we're willing to come out to anybody and do a presentation. Any organization, any school, if you want Gender Health Center to come out and do a presentation on sex and gender, we will do that, and that's free charge, free service.
Cool. Okay, thank you guys. I just wanted to say
thanks.
Takes me a minute.
No worries.
Well, first I want to thank you guys. I'm from the generation where transgender wasn't talked about, and I'm a transgender man. And I remember, I knew I was a boy. But I also remember my father putting my friends up to ask me, when are you going to start acting more like a female? Well, now I have an answer. The 12th of never.
That's a good answer.
But my biggest comment is on the misguided individuals who are trying to pass in the other states those bathroom laws that say I'd have to use the ladies' room. Look at me, folks. Twice now I've been forced to use the ladies' room. It doesn't end well. I've been assaulted and I've had the police called on me because I was forced to use the ladies' room. So I'm just here to say we need gender neutral bathrooms because we're not the ones who are going to endanger others in a restroom. We're the ones who are in danger in a public restroom.
Right.
That's true.
Okay, thank you.
That's true. And by those same laws, I would have to use the male's bathroom. So imagine that.
Right.
I think that some of the people who are in support of those quote-unquote bathroom laws, well, they think they're doing a good thing. Everybody thinks they're doing a good thing, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't do it, probably. They think that they're preventing girls, that they're protecting girls, right? And yet they're not realizing that preventing transgender people from using the restroom that is most appropriate for them is not an effective sexual assault prevention strategy at all, because you're really talking about two totally separate issues. I mean, yes, we want to have sexual assault prevention strategies, and we want to make sure that we have welcoming spaces for transgender people. And to pit one against the other, I think, is very dangerous. And actually, it's a classic strategy to tear different communities down, right? You take different marginalized communities and pit them against each other, and it basically maintains the status quo. And I think it's really important to be able to see that for what it is.
This is our last question.
Thank you both again for providing this informational workshop for us. I am the grandmother of a 7-year-old grandson who was assigned, or apparently assigned, female genitalia at birth. He was able to let us know socially that he was a boy from the moment he could speak. And the last 6 years, we've been hoping it was a tomboyish kind of situation that he was going through. In the last year, he's basically come out by transitioning to wearing all boys clothing. And this last, I guess it was in January or February, he finally cut his long hair, the braids that he would wear for the last 6 years. He cut them off completely and wears a really short punk-looking, punk rocker type of haircut. He is the happiest boy I've ever seen in the last 6 years, 7 years, because he had been struggling. We had been struggling. He hadn't been struggling. We had been, as a family, struggling to allow him to do that because we were so afraid of what the family would say, the extended family. And today we have, my husband and I have
6 support family members who have come to support us to get educated about our new Rex. We no longer have Camila in our lives, but we have Rex, a name that he has assigned to himself. I wanted to let people know that we've been doing a lot of research, and you mentioned that in this day and age, because of the internet, there's a lot of young people becoming informed about the subject. Well, let me tell you, there's a lot of grandparents being informed about it too, and parents. And we have found out, we're lucky we live in the Bay Area in some ways because there's more support there. I'm not saying that there's not enough support here, but being close to San Francisco and Berkeley, Rex is now going to a school near Berkeley, and the school is very accepting of in working with us in going through the transition. He's not fully out to all of his classmates. He's been coming out one at a time to his classmates, depending on who he feels comfortable letting know, and the principal and the rest of the school is working very closely with us. But I wanted to make the announcement that at the end of July, I believe it's the 22nd and 23rd, or whatever that Saturday and Sunday is, or 23rd and 24th, Gender Spectrum in the Bay Area is hosting or co-hosting a family conference for families who have transgender members in their family. And we will be participating along with other family members to become more aware of this. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for anybody in the audience who might be interested in getting to know more about the transitioning part of it or adaptation to attend the conference. It does cost money, but I think there's scholarships available. So it's going to be sponsored at St. Mary's College, ironically. Thank you.
Thank you for that information. Over on the table over there, I put together a list of local Sacramento resources as well as national transgender resources, so you can feel free to help yourselves to that. And your comment reminded me that one thing I did not include on there, but I think really is important to include, is that the Sac City Unified School District has an office that's designated to LGBT student issues, and they've done a lot of work in terms of advocating for transgender students. And so it's good to know that we have that resource within our local school system.
Thank you so much. Whenever I post on social media, which is probably more than library staff and colleagues would like me to do, I always hashtag I love my job. And I have to say that today I love my job more than ever. I thank you all so much for being such a great audience, and you two really exceeded all of our expectations.